Welcome. Today we will be learning how to create pivot tables in Microsoft Excel. This instruction was designed for the administrative assistants and fiscal technicians that work at James Madison University. It is tailored to include the reporting data typically used at the university. However, this instruction is still useful for anyone wanting to learn how to create a pivot table in Excel. Pivot tables are one of Excel's most powerful tools. This tool allows the user to find significance and extract specific data in large spreadsheets. The pivot table is a rotation or summary of a larger table. Once you've learned how useful this tool is, you'll be able to summarize data for a variety of tasks and projects. In this tutorial, you will learn how to summarize and analyze data using pivot tables in Microsoft Excel, how to change pivot table operations and drill down to view the data, how to format your pivot table using styles and apply conditional formatting to summarize your data visually, and share your data as printed or PDF documents. Let's get started. A pivot table looks similar to a worksheet with rows and columns of data. The data here is the type of report that can be found in the Human Resource Management System. It's a compilation of all the payroll information for one fiscal year. As you can see, this spreadsheet is very long. It contains a lot of information. I want to view this in a format that's easier to read and compiles my information by account code or employee. To create a pivot table from an Excel table or data list, click any cell within the worksheet, go to the Insert tab at the top. To the far left, you'll see a few options: Pivot Table and Recommended Pivot Tables. Today, we'll use Pivot Table, so we'll click on that, and a dialog box opens. The first thing it's asking is for you to choose the data you want to analyze. We've already done that by clicking on the cell in the worksheet. The second question is choose where you want the pivot table report to be placed. I always choose New Worksheet. If we chose Existing Worksheet, it would put the data in this worksheet here, and it can make things really confusing. So choose New Worksheet and click OK. This is your pivot table. You'll want to make sure you're clicked inside of it for it to be active. When your pivot table is active, you have a pivot table fields box over here to the right. Your new pivot table sheet has been added in front of your source data sheet. So as you can see, your source data is still here, and then sheet 1 is your pivot table. So let's get started building our pivot table. The first thing I'm going to do is move name. I'm going to click and drag that down to the rows box. You can see here that all the names that were in our original source data sheet have now been added to the pivot table. Next, I'm going to take Pay Run ID, and I'm going to move that to columns. And you can see here that now each column has a Pay Run ID number. I'm going to move Account Code underneath Name and Account Code Description under that. And then I'm going to take Amount, and I'm going to put Amount in the Values field. When you do that, it allows the spreadsheet to total all of the pay that's been accumulated. Now, in the rows box, we have name, account code description. Over here, you can see name, account code description. But I don't really like the layout of this. I think it looks a little bit confusing and still kind of difficult for me to see what I'm doing. So I'm actually going to come over here and take name, and I'm going to slide that down underneath of account code description. And now I can look at it in an easier format. It's much easier for me to read, and I can filter my data by account code. I'm going to make a few edits to this table. Where it says row labels, I'm going to change that to account code. And where it says column labels, I'm going to change that to pay run ID. We will look at some other formatting options later in the video. In my department, we spend a lot of time analyzing student wages. Let's filter the table so we can see those results. You go up to the account code drop-down box, uncheck select all, and then we'll find the student wage account number 114400, and I'm going to click on that and hit OK. Now you can see the table is showing all the payroll that generated from 114400. Each student's total payments are at the top, the side, and the bottom, so they're totaled on all three sides. If I want to look at a particular student as opposed to all of the students, I can go over here to my pivot table fields box. I can just slide name back up to the top. And then I can actually filter the name. So I'm going to uncheck all the students and I'm going to look at Jackson Boyd. Click OK. And all of Jackson Boyd's information comes up. I was able to isolate one student. But I actually need this student's employee ID number as well. So I'm going to go over here to the pivot table fields box again. I'm going to click and drag employee ID and put it right underneath of name. So now I also have the employee ID if I need that. Once you're done, you can clear the filter by clicking Clear Filter in the drop-down. So you can actually go right here, Clear Filter from Name. And that brings back all of the student information, and we can move name back down underneath here again if we decide we want to do that. I've removed all of the filters that we had on our data, so we're back to our original pivot table. Let's look at some formatting options before we move on to other pivot tables. If you go to the top here, you'll see a shaded area called Pivot Table Tools. We're going to click on the Analyze button. I'm just going to briefly touch on a few of these. Pivot table name, you can give your pivot table a name. Active field that you're in currently. Field list, the buttons and headers, that gives you options in your pivot table fields box. Recommended pivot tables. I do recommend that you get some original source data and play with the recommended pivot tables option. Excel actually looks at and analyzes your data and gives you some really great options on how best to sort your data, and you may find one that works really well for you. Pivot chart actually makes your data into a chart. That's also a really great feature if you want to play with that. Move pivot table, you can move the table to another place in your worksheet. If you have 25 tabs, you can actually tell Excel where you want to move it. Another important feature on the Analyze tab is the refresh. Anytime, if I would go into my source data and make any changes, additions, subtractions, or change numbers, you actually need to go back to your pivot table and refresh the data. If you don't refresh the data, it doesn't automatically update itself. So be sure anytime you make changes to source data, you also refresh pivot table. I actually right click and hit refresh, but you can also use this option up here in the ribbon. Let's click on the Design tab, and we're going to pull down the Pivot Table Styles window. You can see there's a lot of different styles, and as I hover over each one, it actually changes for me so I can see what I'm looking at. I usually try to pick something that's fairly easy on the eyes so that if my supervisor wants to view my data, it's not overwhelming for them to look at. So I'm going to choose the blue. You have a couple options here also. You can have banded rows, banded columns. There's several options here. Most of this is just personal preference. One thing I do want to touch on, I usually go to the subtotals option is if you'll notice the pivot table actually subtotals the data at the top of the group instead of at the bottom. And of course, in my world, the totals are always at the bottom. So most of the time I go in and click show also subtotals at bottom of group, and that moves everything down. So there's some really good options here, really nice ways to make your tables look very professional. And I encourage you to take some time to look at those options. I would like to show you one more useful pivot table using information obtained through the finance system in PeopleSoft. I have my financial data here. This is a report that I pull each month in PeopleSoft. It's a query, and it pulls all of my expense information for the month, and I just compile it all into this worksheet each month. I have added 2 columns that don't come in the query: department contact and description. And each month I put what employee is associated with the charge. And if I have any descriptive information, I add that over here. So I have a table of data, and I want to compile this data into something I can work with. One of the things I would like to know is how my employees are spending and what they're spending their money on. So we're already clicked into the worksheet, so it's active. We're going to go to Insert and then Pivot Table. We've already chosen our table by clicking into the worksheet, and we do want a new worksheet for the pivot table to open, so we're going to click OK. We're already active in our pivot table. Pivot table field box is open. Our original source data is still down here, and we are in a new tab, and we're going to build our pivot table. So we're going to decide how we want to build this pivot table. One of the things that's most important for me is the department contact. So I'm going to click and drag that into my rows column. And description. So I'm also going to add that underneath department contact. And as you can see, the pivot table is starting to take shape. I can see the employee name. I can see all of the descriptors that I added into the spreadsheet that tell me what they are spending money on. Now I'm going to find the actual expense, and I'm going to click and drag that into the values box. As you can see, this populated as a date. So I'm just going to highlight the column, format those cells into an accounting. And so now we have our numbers. And as you can see, I am now outside of the pivot table, my active cell. So my pivot table fields box is no longer there. Once I click back into my pivot table, everything comes back up and I can continue to work. Right now, we can see expense information by employee, what amount they spent, what the expense description is, and then there is a total at the top of each employee in bold. I actually prefer to see my totals at the bottom, so I'm going to go up here to the Pivot Table Tools tab, click on Design, go to Subtotals, and Show All Subtotals at Bottom of Group. And you can see that moved my total to the bottom of the group, which makes a lot more sense. I'm going to change row labels to say Employee. And I'm going to choose my pivot table style. And you can choose one that works for you. Choose something that has softer colors and gives your table just the right amount of separation in the data. Harsh colors are difficult for other people to read. So if you're going to be sharing this with a supervisor, you might consider something a little bit softer. I think I want to add a filter. So I'm going to come over here and choose vendor name. I want to filter the results by vendor name. So I'm going to click and drag vendor name 1 down into the filter box. You can see over here, the pivot table, a filter has been added. If we click on this box, the drop down, It includes every vendor name that's included in the original source data. I want to specifically look at what we've paid Arts Council of the Valley, so I'm going to click on that and hit OK. And that shows me that particular charge, how much money we spent, and what employee was associated with that expense. So I'm going to go back in and hit all so I can see everything again. You can make your data in your pivot table any way you like. You can choose any of these options over here. If you need your journal ID number, if you need your accounting period, any of those things can go into these boxes to create the pivot table that works best for you. Practice using your pivot tables in various ways, and when your supervisor asks for specific data, you'll be able to quickly obtain it. I use data from this sheet to create an outlook of expenses for the upcoming year, and I go to each employee and discuss with each employee what they have spent, and if they think the new year expenses will remain the same, or if they're aware of any upcoming expenses that I might need to be aware of. Let's quickly discuss sharing pivot tables before we exit. Click into any cell in your pivot table, go to the Analyze tab, and click on the Select button. Choose Entire Pivot Table. Now go to the Page Layout tab, click the Print Area button, and select Set Print Area. Now click Control P, and that opens the dialog box for printing. You're ready to print. You can also save the pivot table as a PDF to avoid editing by going to File, Save As, and choosing PDF in the drop-down. I hope this video has helped you better understand pivot tables and how to create them to analyze your business data more effectively. Today, we learned how to summarize and analyze data using pivot tables, change pivot table operations, format pivot tables using styles, and share and print pivot tables. I would like to provide a valuable learning resource for this and many other applications. This, of course, is lynda.com, which is free to JMU employees when signed in through the JMU homepage. You can walk step by step through many courses while sitting at your desk. Thank you for viewing this course today, and please fill out the evaluation at your convenience.